In our particular moment, we're looking at a trial that's being argued and decided on a level of policy precision and expecting it to address large culture-wide issues.
This week, the decision was handed down in Minneapolis that the police officer, Derek Chauvin, was found guilty on 3 counts. I think two manslaughter or two counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter in the death of George Floyd last summer. So this was the incident where George Floyd is a black man, and the police officer, who is white, in attempting to arrest him, knelt on his neck for almost 9 or 10 minutes, and he died after that. And so he was found guilty of murder this week. And this has been, there was a lot of tension before the verdict was handed down that there was going to be political unrest if he was not found guilty, and that was a plausible worry because that did happen last summer after this event took place. There was rioting and a lot of protests across the country. So that decision was handed down this week. On the same day that decision came down, there was an incident in my city, Columbus, Ohio, where a black teenage girl was shot by police as she was attempting to stab another girl. There was, a violent fight happening, and a white police officer showed up to the scene, and he shot her and killed her. And that immediately led to a lot of protests, at least here in Columbus. I don't know if there's been protesting across the country, but it certainly made national headlines. And a lot of people were seeing these two stories as part of one bigger story, obviously, in terms of racial tension and policing. So that's kind of the gist of what happened this week with the decision and then the shooting here in Columbus. What was your kind of reaction right when that all came down?
Well, we got a sense of the size of the trial, just obviously given the media coverage leading up to it,
Mm-hmm.
the gravity of the event last summer, the protest, and then the riots that descended from that event. Um, uh, in a sense, I kind of remember being in college when the OJ trial verdict was read. That kind of becoming such a momentous event culturally speaking, and it's not often that happens. I mean, you can think of just a handful of trials. A few, the trial of the century in the 20th century was the Scopes trial until the OJ trial, and that became kind of the trial of the century. And then in the 21st century, so far, I'm sure it won't be the last word on this, but this is kind of taken that role because it is so much weight is being put on this particular case to give meaning to the whole state of the current racial divide in America. To basically whether or not people saw this trial as whether or not there was a ray of hope for justice for a hopelessly racist nation, or whether it was over. We certainly had pundits that got the verdict that they wanted in this case and then still put the weight on the trial, like, that doesn't absolve this nation, that doesn't mean we're in any better state than we were before, things like that. So it's just interesting that this case was not about particularly this case. On the other hand, people who wanted the verdict to come down the other direction, it was a case about defending the police,
Mm-hmm.
and whether certain theories that have become popular across the academic world and now across popular culture, most notably critical race theory, what was going to win or not. So that was so much weight put onto this because this is a case that basically said if this comes out one way, then critical race theory has won the day. If this comes out the other way, then our nation is hopelessly racist. So that was kind of the only two options on the table for so many people. And I don't just mean, people kind of commenting their own opinions on social media. That was the impression that we got from our president and our vice president. That was the impression we got from, the unquestioned leaders in media on both the left and the right. That's an awful lot of weight to put on a case where it's quite possible that the system did what the system was supposed to do. Well, you had people holding policing accountable with video evidence, with eyewitness testimony. You had other police officers holding police officers accountable for how they police this particular situation. You have a systemic brokenness across certain parts of American culture with drug abuse that was part of George Floyd's story. And then whether or not, then even so, this policing was done in such a way to contribute to his death. A jury of his peers, which is what the Constitution gives, which is a remarkable blessing to the American experience and to the American and to our American history. Carried all the way through. And as a jury gave the opinion. Now, I think there's right concern about, look, was a fair trial possible? What do you do when there's so much media involved? All that's very, all of those questions are incredibly legitimate. There's no question at all. But at the same time, the system did what the system did, and the system gave a guilty verdict. And I think from the experts that's a reasonable verdict on these counts, and especially on these counts. There wasn't a first-degree homicide, count, which implies intention. I mean, there's so many details on these things, and when you let the system do it, when you let the system work, Maria, you have to look at the charge, look at what the evidence points to, and then realize that, look, there's a jury that's going to decide. On the cases having to do with police officers and African American victims in other situations that have come out the other way, a lot of it, again, has to do with detail. In other words, what policies have police agreed to operate by, and did they agree to operate by them? And, when you talk about other names that are now part of this national conversation, the verdict goes the other way. And so that's what's hard about this system is letting it work. Not to say that it's infallible, not to say that it can't be influenced, but that's the situation we got this week.
Right. And there's a reason that at the beginning of trials, attorneys explain to the jury, here's what you're being asked. They define beyond a reasonable doubt. They define the charges, because it's not going up to a person who saw the video and saying, do you think he killed him? There's so much more to it. I agree with you. After spending some time this week reading the details of what these charges explicitly mean, and then reading the evidence, one of these manslaughter charges, for example, dealt specifically with neglect, criminal neglect. And I think Chauvin's own police chief testified that, our policy is, once the pulse stops or once the person loses consciousness, you get off them and you help. And so, I think they met that burden of proof. But again, that's a nuanced, thing to look at the actual charges and what they say.
Yeah,
But
and
I
that's
think
the
it's
misalignment.
worth.
And that's the misalignment, Maria. Sorry to interrupt, but that's the misalignment.
Yeah.
Because because each of these trials is conducted on that level of specificity for each trial.
Right.
And even, us looking and saying, I can see where a jury would come up with the verdict that they did, doesn't mean we know all. I mean, we weren't there. We weren't given all the evidence. We didn't see the unedited, entire footage or whatever else was part of this whole conversation.
Right.
But in our particular moment, we're looking at a trial that's being argued and decided on a level of policy precision, and expecting it to address large culture-wide issues, right?
Right.
It's just not able to do that, but that's what we're expecting it to do. And and our, especially, I think our political leaders should know better. It's like a big game of Jenga, and we're putting this whole superstructure on this one precise little piece of wood and hoping that it's not going to topple over.
Yeah. And that strikes me as, in a sense, deeply dehumanizing, because this case involves specific people. George Floyd and this police officer and George Floyd's family and the police department, but this involved specific people. George Floyd was not a symbol, right? And neither was Derek Chauvin. They're both people. And to talk about this in any sort of way as if it's a symbol, and I think it can symbolize something, but I feel like sometimes we're talking about it as if it's only a symbol and not a person. And that is deeply dehumanizing. And I'm sure that we're guilty of doing this in other areas of politics and even things that we talk about here at the Colson Center, that sometimes things can get really theoretical because that's the easiest way to talk about stuff. But this is a good reminder that these situations are deeply human and specific. It actually reminded me of, this seems like a tangent, but I promise it's connected. I remember when the movie Juno came out. So this is about a high school girl who gets pregnant and ends up having the baby and putting it up for adoption. I remember reading a review that was deeply critical of this movie because they said, this is, painting a glossy picture over unintended pregnancy, and not every adoption ends happily. And it struck me as so bizarre at the time. I think I was in college when I read that, because I thought, this is a story, though. This is a movie about one story of one girl. Is anybody allowed to write a story anymore? Or does every story have to be symbolic in the correct way? And I think that issue is what we're seeing here as well, that for some reason, we either lack the attention or we're too excited to jump on a narrative, that we are throwing out the possibility of looking at individual stories for what they are.
That's
And
such an important
I get
point.
the temptation, but it's a dangerous thing to do.
It's a dangerous thing to do, and it is profoundly dehumanizing. I had family in town this week, and we went over to the Olympic Museum in Colorado Springs, which might be my
Oh,
recommendation later on
cool.
in the program. It's super cool, just a couple years old, but they were talking about the first Paralympics when it was held in LA, and the reason the Russians gave, if I got my dates right, not the first Paralympics, but I don't remember all the math. I remember there was a Paralympics where the Russians decided not to participate because they said we don't have any invalids in this country.
Ooh,
And it's kind of like when Iceland said, we've eradicated Down syndrome.
yeah.
Like, there's a reason. In other words, the narrative needs to be the Russians are better than everybody else. The Soviet Union is better than everyone else, to be precise there. And so therefore that guy in the wheelchair doesn't exist. That's a remarkable, that is such a remarkable place to be. And that is oftentimes this tension between the one and the many is the tension that every single worldview has to deal with. Christianity deals with it in a wonderful parable where the shepherd leaves the 99 and goes after the one. Christianity deals with it with a wonderful vision of the human person called the image of God, which is unprecedented in any other religious worldview, other than, of course, in the Jewish roots of Christianity. And Christianity deals with it with the Messiah, the Savior of the world, who comes and also makes himself personally known to the lame, the beggar, the thief on the cross, the morally and physically decrepit, of which we are all part of.
And
Christianity handles that one and many problem in a remarkable way. Cultural narratives don't. They just can't.
yeah,
And that's why I go back to where we began today, which is it's really, really hard to think like a Christian in this cultural moment.
yeah,
It really is. I want to acknowledge that. I want to do it humbly, because as we tackle these issues, man, these are really hard things, and it's not a lack of conviction about image of God or human value or right and wrong or any of these issues. It's just that one in many problem is a really big problem to navigate.
yeah. And I think Jesus didn't just reveal himself in a deeply personal way. He also demonstrated that he cared about people in a deeply personal way. He cared about each person he talked to. He told his followers, take up your specific cross and follow me, not join a group or a movement that appears to be following me, if that makes sense. And there's something really empowering about that, but also very challenging. But it strikes me too. So I'm in the middle of Carl Trueman's book, which is the Colson Center's book of the month, that you can get, by the way, if you go to colsoncenter.org. for a gift of any amount to the Colson Center this month, you'll get this book. I've had it for a couple months on my shelf, but just finally picked it up this month. It's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And in a lot of ways, it feels like a philosophy class in college that I never took and should have taken. And I think we don't realize, at least my generation and probably yours too. It's a relatively recent psychological development in the past 200 or so years to think of that personal meaning exists in systems, like not necessarily inside of each individual person. So, for example, Truman is talking about the chapter I read last night, is talking about Friedrich Nietzsche and how his idea was that there might not be, now correct me if I'm wrong on this, there might not be an essential human nature where there's something meaningful about human beings because they're human beings, that they're not animals, they had to have been created by a designer. Once you get rid of all of that, right, then there's a vacuum of meaning that people need to continue living, to put one foot in front of the other. So what we tend to do then is to put meaning in systems. We say culture and ethics and morality are determined by our systems, by our infrastructure, by our social infrastructure, by what happens when people all get together in one big group. So that some of that thinking has, and Carl Truman makes the argument, that has seeped into the way we live today, in so much that people who have never read Nietzsche, like me, don't realize that we're swimming in his water now. And that, I think, explains partly why people look at the trial, for example, this week, and have such a difficult time looking at it in terms of individual people. And they need to feel like it's symbolic of a system or a systemic problem, and that if there is a problem here, it is a systemic one, not at all a personal one. Did I get that right?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, there's so many implications of saying God is dead, and that's the simplicity of Nietzsche. Who wasn't simple, and those people who have run with his ideas, notably the French philosophers of the mid 20th century, who gave us what we now know as postmodernism, which has now had a whole bunch of children, including critical theory and others. So maybe my recommendation just changed to the Parable of the Madman, which, if you've not
Yeah.
read, explains the 20th century. Namely, around one line, how did we unchain this earth from its sun? So think about one of the great discoveries of the scientific revolution, that the earth revolves around the sun. Now take the sun away, you've got to redefine everything, not to mention the earth goes out into the abyss and we all die. But the idea of God is dead is that God is the sun, and we've built the entire our experience, human experience, both as individuals and as people together, around that system or around that fundamental belief. And so everything's got to be rethought, everything's got to be redefined. And so much of the 20th and 21st century was rethinking political power, rethinking criminal code, rethinking crime and punishment, rethinking education and employment and the aims and goals of technology. And I mean, it just lines up outside of some sort of at least moral, if not full-on real framework of reality. So at least a moral framework, if not a complete framework of reality, that revolves around this idea that there is something outside of us that determines what's right and wrong, determines what's real, determines what's true, and determines what we're for, what meaning is all about. So it has enormous implications. And so, I mean, look, it seems very detached emotionally and even intellectually to source our current chaos around a cultural incident like the horrific death of George Floyd, and the weight put on it and all of that, all the way back to that kind of framework. But there is something there that needs to be connected. I want to go up maybe just a little bit more simple, however, in terms of trying to make a worldview analysis of this, and something hopefully that makes sense. I see two kind of worldview problems at work, and they both stem from our the struggle that every worldview has to balance the one and the many, right? How do you have the value of the one and the cause of the many without having one eat the other? So one thing that comes out of that is this view of our side is good and their side is bad. So we fail to understand the true issue of the human condition. And that is that there's a brokenness that's both in here and out there. There's a brokenness that exists both for me and for them. And so if somebody makes an argument on that side, I have to make the opposite argument on this side. We've at least got to acknowledge that there's a problem when there's literally nothing we can agree on, right? When that other side says whatever they say, they're wrong, and so this side has to be take the opposite view. We saw that at work in this case. There was no room that was given in media. There was also no room that was given in conservative media or liberal media, either side, for that there was a number of issues that needed to be adjudicated here. It was just simple. They're wrong, we're right, period. And this, people know how much I love to quote Solzhenitsyn, but this is one of those lines. He said, I used to think that if only we could just take all of them, the people that were wrong with the world, and gather them up and get them out of here, then that would solve the problem. But the line of good and evil runs right down the middle of every human heart. That's a biblical view of what it means to be human post-fall, that helps make sense of the one and the many. That helps make sense of people looking at the same data, the same incident, the same event, and coming up with different sides. There needs to be at least some level of humility on this side, and also a realization on the other side. The other worldview issue that I see that emerges in this, without going all the way back to Nietzsche. And by the way, if you go all the way back to Nietzsche, you got to go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. So this is the problem of infinite causes. But there also is this problem of the personal and the structural, because we have embraced that first premise that our side is good and their side is bad. We hear so many Christians, for example, trying to make sense of what we think is an overreach and blaming everything on systemic evils like systemic racism by saying there's no such thing as systemic evil and systemic racism. To say that everything is the result of systemic racism is a worldview that is too small. To say that there's no such thing as systemic racism or systemic evil in particular, and systemic racism could be an expression of systemic evil, that's a worldview too small as well. The one thing that is clear in the scripture is that the problem of the human heart can take structural or social form. I point you to Genesis chapter 6, right before God says, I got to go do something about this, where the author of Genesis says, every thought of every person was only evil all the time. I mean, that's systemic, right? That's social. You talk about the way the Israelites had to respond to the Egyptian Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Why? Because there was a systemic oppression that was placed. That's systemic evil. You think about in the prophets, when the prophets describe why God gave Israel the land of promise. It wasn't just because of the promise made to Abraham, the scripture says. It's also because of the systemic ways that the Canaanites committed evil against the Lord. You look at the evils within the nation of Israel after Israel and Judah split. You have kings that are systemically putting, worship of evil. You can even see the systemic nature creep out of Solomon's life, and I think it's 1 Kings 11, and then go into, the wider culture. Look, we can look at Jim Crow laws and say that's a systemic reflection of something that's sinful and wrong. We can look at slavery and say the same thing. So to say that there's no such thing, and I'm hearing too many pastors, try to make sense of this, and I understand that we're reacting against a system that blames everything on this. So what happened this week in your town, Maria, is a case in point. So what happened? A horrible event where a 16-year-old girl is shot by police who is attempting to stab two girls, has a knife in her hand, literally is swinging the knife at a girl when she gets shot. Now, um, that's a horrific position to find yourself in as a law enforcement officer, to feel
Mhm.
like, look, I'm either gonna, wait, she's gonna stab this girl, that girl's gonna die, and then this girl that stabbed her then needs to be subdued, and then there's a chance of this, or I'm going to protect that. I don't know how you make that decision. There are reason, the heroic people join the ranks. There's also a reason, by the way, power hungry people join the ranks of the police force. But there's a reason that heroic people join the ranks of the police force. But what happened immediately? LeBron James turned around and tweeted that this was the exact same thing and called for violence, essentially, against the police officer. I
Mhm.
mean, this is an immediate category of us versus them.
Yeah.
And it's immediately failing to understand that evil is both personal and systemic. Look,
I think
if we're sorry, let me say one more punchline.
go ahead.
I feel like I've interrupted you too many times today, Maria. Forgive
No,
me.
you're fine. Please keep going.
But I just this has got to be, if the worldview lenses through which we're looking at all these incidents are too small, and I owe that phrase, by the way, to Steve Garber. Not everything that I'm thinking here, just Steve Garber. I don't want to put on him my thoughts on this, I, but his idea is that a worldview has to be big enough for the world. It has to actually deal with the challenges of the real world. The problem that we're facing right now is we're in a world where the dominant perspectives on both the right and the left are politically driven, and political worldviews are too small. They're not big enough because they don't take seriously the human condition. And the human condition is that there's evil in the human heart. We're what's wrong with the world. And that sin takes on a life of its own and can invade entire structures. That's why we see national oppression. That's why we see attempts to exterminate people with Down syndrome. That's why we see, the injustices on race that have been part of American history. Now, to turn around and blame everything that's wrong as if, a 16-year-old girl with a knife has no evil intent, you see what I mean? It's just too small for the world. There was
Right.
another story this week about Planned Parenthood that emerged, that also, I think, plays into this conversation. But you were going to say something, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say I think it would be helpful at this point to talk about what we mean by the word systemic, because I
Sure.
think when a lot of people hear that systemic racism or systemic evil, what they hear, at least people whose defenses go up at hearing that, what they'll hear is, so you're asserting that, every legislator for the past 30 years has had like a deep racism in their hearts, is self-aware of that racism, and as they pen their legislation, it's all to that end. How do you define
Well,
that?
let's talk about it, and I'll give you my third recommendation for the day before we get to recommendations, which is a recommendation I've given dozens of times on this program, and that is Neil Plantinga's book, "Not the Way It's Supposed to Be: A Breviary of Sin." It's the most, I think, thorough and helpful theological treatment of sin that there is. Um, so what we mean by systemic evil is not always systemic racism. Racism is an evil, and all evil can take systemic forms, even though it is sourced, it's created by the human heart. But if you ignore, let me give you first of all the kind of the impact. If you ignore that evil can indeed be systemic, then you're at risk of having huge blind spots.
Mhm.
And if you ignore that whatever systemic injustices or evils that you experience actually are rooted in a common human, uh, uh, the common humanity that we share, that we're made in the image of God, but there's something deeply and desperately wrong with us. It's getting those first two chapters of the four-chapter biblical story right, creation and fall. What we're talking about today is that a worldview that doesn't get that second chapter right, whether it is one that ignores that there is such a thing as systemic evil, or whether it's one that puts everything on systemic evil, as if some people, because they're on our side, are somehow immune from having evil intent or self-serving intent or something like that, then you have a blind spot there too, right?
Mm.
You actually will never get to the real problem, right? So on
Right.
one side you have a blind spot, on the other side you have the wrong diagnosis of the problem that never gets to the real solution. Let me give you an example of what we mean by systemic evil. and then also talk about, just quickly, I know this is going to be a super long segment for our podcast listeners, but let me just talk about what we mean by this through a story that came out this week, and then also talk about kind of how this plays out in society, where that blind spot affects us. So this week, Planned Parenthood's president penned an op-ed in which in the New York Times, where they basically said, look, we can't cover up for Margaret Sanger anymore. We've got to distance ourselves from our founder.
Mhm.
The interesting part of this is that Margaret Sanger did not like abortion. Many people miss that. She actually thought abortion was barbaric. Her way of accomplishing her eugenic vision of the world, in which the unfit, as she called them, which were racial minorities and the poor, which, of course, as one of those pure Darwinists of the early 20th century, believed that everything was genetically caused. And so if someone was poor for generations, then it was they couldn't help it. So the best way to increase prosperity, she thought, across the board, was to eliminate those that were either, generationally poor or, an ethnic minority. So that we should, after all, humans are animals. We breed better cattle. We might as well breed,
Right.
we breed
Or
better cattle.
disabled or sickly
All of those,
or
yeah, they,
yeah,
they they should all be eliminated.
right.
Now those views were deeply racist, and yet she still thought abortion was wrong, or not really wrong. I mean, she didn't really have those categories, but she thought it was bad. Now Planned Parenthood has rejected her hesitations against abortion, since it's their primary strategy as an organization, and it's their primary funding source as an organization, and they have carried that out. And yet, they have disproportionately targeted, as part of their history, poor neighborhoods, the neighborhoods of ethnic minorities, so that, as most estimates put it, somewhere in a neighborhood of 80+% of all Planned Parenthood abortion facilities are in ethnic minority neighborhoods.
Mhm.
This is why we have in New York City more African American babies being aborted than born for how many years in a row.
Yeah.
So this is what we're actually now talking about, is that in Planned Parenthood, now if you call Planned Parenthood, if you stopped any worker and you asked them if they're racist, or if you could look for evidence of personal racism, you wouldn't be able to find it, right? I mean, maybe some, I don't know, but most of them wouldn't. They think they're
Mhm.
actually helping. Most of them. I mean, this is Abby Johnson's story. She thought she was actually helping, right?
Yeah.
These poor women. And yet, all the evidence points to Planned Parenthood's original eugenics and racist founder, Margaret Sanger, putting into the system now what we're seeing in the outcomes of the system of Planned Parenthood. It doesn't take personal racism to, for every person to have, systemic evils put into the system. Now, we could say the same thing about all kinds of things. We could say, for example, a nation that turns its back on God. We could talk about the godless Soviet Union and what it did to its citizens and how it actually looked after, people. We could talk about the Chinese treatment of the Muslim Uyghurs. Listen, the officials that are carrying that out think that many of them probably think that they're doing the best thing possible. In other words, their intention might even be positive,
Hmm.
and yet they're carrying out systemic evil. That's what we mean. I think we think that evil from the human action is like, okay, this person, it's like they put this rock in this clear glass of water, so we need to pull that rock back out. No, sin is like a drop of dye that goes into the water and just, coats the whole thing. Right? So that's what I mean
Right.
by systemic. It's the outcome of evil actions, where sin and evil take on a life of its own. And when we underestimate that, then it's a huge blind spot. Now, I
And
want
we
to talk a
can't
little bit about
solve
how
it.
I want to talk a little bit about how that blind spot works, because I think it's important for us to understand as well. But did that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think to me, the warning there, kind of the challenge there, is that if we do believe in systemic evil, the possibility of it, which I think is biblical, we have to, then we have to acknowledge that a person in the back room working on a calculator can be a part of something that's evil, even if that person doesn't realize it or, we need to think about what we're doing. And what's really interesting about the Planned Parenthood story, there's a couple of things there. The first thing I noticed was that the current president and CEO of Planned Parenthood, did a longer interview in Harper's Bazaar about this situation, and they're kind of distancing themselves from Margaret Sanger. And one of the strangest parts of the interview, I thought, was that she was determined to say that Margaret Sanger was not racist, but she had, it was bad that she, specifically wanted eugenics. Like she didn't want, okay, so she didn't want disabled kids to be born. She didn't want like really poor families to have more children, but she wasn't racist. As if like there was a weird, like racism is the really bad one, and the fact that she like didn't think disabled people were fully human is like, okay, well, we're not having a social reckoning about that right now, so I don't feel the need to cover for her for that, which was
Think about that same
alarming.
framework being applied to the police question right now.
Oh my goodness, right?
You know what I mean? I mean, that's the
But
blind spots that I'm talking about when your worldview is not big enough, is think about applying that same framework. Margaret Sanger spoke at a Ku Klux Klan rally,
yeah.
but she's not a
And
racist.
that is its own blind spot, because what's implicit in that is she considered being an ethnic minority being disabled. Like the reason she devalued disability was because she felt like it was in some way, in some categorical way, less than human. And if she was pushing the same, like, we got to get birth control into these low income and ethnic minority neighborhoods, it's because she also clearly felt that ethnic minorities were less than human as well. The other really interesting thing about this story is that, so probably the biggest name right now in our cultural discussion about anti-racism is Ibram Kendi. So he's a professor and an author, and he wrote, I think, How to Be an Anti-Racist was the big book that kind of took off last year. And one of his really controversial but really big ideas that has caught on is that intent does not matter, that effect matters over intent. So even if the guy working on his calculator in the back room isn't a racist person, if he's part of a racist system that has what Ibram Kendi would consider to be a racist result, then this person is a racist, and he's part of, systemic racism. I think that that's biblically incorrect. I also think that that's not applied evenly across all portions of society, which is what we're seeing with Planned Parenthood. So let's just run with that for a second. If that were true, then Planned Parenthood is the single most racist organization that has arguably ever existed.
Literally ever existed, yeah.
I mean, it kills more Black and brown people, I think, than any other organization or system you could ever, the police 5 times over, whatever it is, I mean, so if that, we've got to be consistent if that's what we're going to consider our definition of racism. But I think for us, what's important to remember is, and this has occurred to me in your kind of really helpful explanation of systemic evil, intent matters a great deal for our own individual souls and our relationship with God and with each other, but also because of the effect that it can inevitably produce. So intent matters. But intent is also not the only thing that matters when you're looking at how to build the kingdom of God. So if you have, you're a person working in a police department, you're not racist, you've never been racist, you're feeling really frustrated at constantly being accused of being racist, understandably. But then there are things happening like, arrests of ethnic minorities get escalated quicker, or their sentencing, is more or they're being sentenced to longer sentences than in other words, if there are effects that are happening that are not good, that's not to say you're morally culpable in a way that you're going to stand before God and have to answer for that. But we should think about those effects if we want to try and make things better. Yeah. So intent matters. Intent also isn't the only thing that matters.
No, and think about the other way of looking at it. If holding both of those things together, the personal and the structure, the intent and the outcome, the one and the many, is essential. Because otherwise, then, if you assume that there's only the structural and not the personal at all, then the situation happens the same week as this verdict, like what happened in Columbus in your city, and immediately it's put into the same box. The bad guys are the same bad guys. The good guys are the same good guys. There's not an evil intent over here. There's only an evil intent over there, and that explains all of it. There's no, reckoning in terms of other moral breakdown